Canada may be on the verge of redrawing its energy map again. And this time, the destination isn't the United States, it's Asia. Over the past few weeks, a new political and economic signal has emerged from Ottawa and Edmonton. A serious push to build another major oil pipeline to Canada's Pacific coast, specifically to expand crude and bitumen exports to Asian markets. The headline sounds straightforward: Canada will build a pipeline to export oil to Asia. But the reality is more complex, more political, and far more consequential than a single piece of steel in the ground. Here's what we know, what's still undecided, and why this pipeline debate is suddenly back at the center of Canada's future. First, the catalyst. On November 27, 2025, Prime Minister Mark Carney and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith signed a Canada-Alberta Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, that frames energy infrastructure as a national economic priority, explicitly tying it to export diversification, competitiveness, and Canada's leverage in a world where trade is becoming more confrontational. The MOU's flagship proposal is a new, or potentially one or more, private sector-built and financed pipeline project designed to move at least 1 million barrels per day of low-emission Alberta bitumen, with export access to Asian markets listed as a priority. It also states that Alberta's application for the pipeline would be ready to submit to a federal major projects office on or before July 1, 2026. And it doesn't stop there. The same backgrounder indicates that this new pipeline would be in addition to further expansion of the Trans Mountain pipeline system, aiming for an extra 300,000 to 400,000 barrels per day destined for Asian markets. That's the what. Now the why. For decades, Canada's oil economy has been heavily anchored to one customer, the United States. That dependence has been profitable, but also limiting. When most of your exports go in one direction, you accept the pricing power, policy risk, and political mood swings of that one market. The MOU's framing makes the intent explicit: to diversify export markets and increase Canada's strategic flexibility. There's also the pricing reality. Western Canadian crude, especially heavy oil, often sells at a discount versus U.S. benchmarks due to quality differences and transportation constraints. Those constraints can become a tax on Canadian producers and, by extension, on public revenues. Alberta's own energy outlook notes persistent factors that keep Western Canadian Select below WTI, including transportation costs and quality differences. Supporters of a new Pacific pipeline argue that adding true export optionality, more tidewater capacity, more buyers, more competition, can narrow that discount and strengthen Canada's negotiating position globally. And we've already seen what one big project can do. Trans Mountain's expansion began commercial operations on May 1st, 2024, increasing capacity to about 890,000 barrels per day and enabling more overseas exports from the BC coast. So, if Trans Mountain helped open a gateway, why is Alberta now pitching something even bigger? Because Trans Mountain may not be enough, especially if production grows and the line fills up. Canada Energy Regulator analysis shows how throughputs ramped after the expansion came online and reached high levels by 2025. And Canadian media reporting indicates Trans Mountain has been evaluating options to boost throughput further. In other words, the pipeline constraint story didn't disappear, it evolved. But if this new plan is so economically attractive, why does it immediately trigger political alarms? Because the Pacific Coast isn't just an endpoint. It's the front line of Canada's environmental and Indigenous rights debates. The MOU itself acknowledges the project must provide opportunities for Indigenous co-ownership and shared economic benefits, and it discusses using federal and provincial loan guarantee mechanisms to backstop Indigenous ownership. That is not a small detail. In fact, Indigenous participation is being positioned as central to the project's legitimacy and viability, and this isn't happening in a vacuum. Bloomberg previously reported on First Nations groups expressing interest in ownership and control models for a Northern Gateway to 2.0 concept, explicitly emphasizing environmental protection and governance. That reference, Northern Gateway, matters because it carries historic weight. Northern Gateway was a major proposed pipeline that became politically toxic and legally vulnerable. In 2016, the Federal Court of Appeal overturned the federal approval, citing inadequate Indigenous consultation. That history is now hovering over every conversation about a new pipeline to northern BC. Consultation isn't optional, it's a legal and social prerequisite. Now we reach the most explosive constraint of all, the tanker ban. Even if you build a pipeline to a deep water port, you still need tankers to move the oil to Asia. But Canada's Oil Tanker Moratorium Act, which received royal assent on June 21st, 2019, prohibits large oil tankers, those carrying more than 12,500 metric tons of crude oil or persistent oils, from stopping, loading, or unloading at ports in the moratorium area along British Columbia's north coast. The MOU directly addresses this. It states that if the pipeline is approved and provides Indigenous co-ownership in shared benefits, Canada will enable bitumen exports from a strategic deepwater port to Asian markets, including, if necessary, through an appropriate adjustment to the Oil Tanker Moratorium Act. That single clause is why this debate is suddenly national again, because adjusting the tanker moratorium isn't a technical tweak. It's a political earthquake for coastal communities, environmental organizations, and many Indigenous nations whose territories and livelihoods are directly tied to the marine environment, and that's exactly why the story is bigger than a pipeline. This MOU is also an energy and climate trade-off package. Reporting from Reuters and other outlets describes the agreement as involving rollbacks or suspensions of major climate regulations, such as dropping the planned oil and gas emissions cap and suspending clean electricity regulations in Alberta pending a new carbon pricing agreement, while emphasizing emissions reductions through carbon pricing and large-scale carbon capture. The MOU also references collaboration with the Pathways Alliance on what it calls the world's largest carbon capture, utilization, and storage project, aimed at lowering the carbon intensity of Alberta oil. So what you're seeing is a strategic pivot, expand market access in infrastructure, while promising emissions management through pricing, methane reductions, and carbon capture, rather than through hard caps and regulations alone. To supporters, that's realism. Canada keeps its resource economy strong while investing in emissions solutions. To critics, it's an unacceptable compromise. More production, more tanker traffic, more spill risk, and a climate strategy that depends on technology and timelines that may not deliver at the scale promised. So where does this go next? First, the big reminder, an MOU is not a shovel in the ground. It's a framework, not a finished project. Even the reporting that breaks down the agreement notes key gaps. The route is not specified. Alberta is expected to submit a proposal by July 1st, 2026, and the pipeline's approval would hinge on a national interest test and Indigenous co-ownership and shared benefits. Second, there's the two-level political reality. Federal approval and provincial or local acceptance are not the same thing. British Columbia's government and affected First Nations will have to be meaningfully engaged, and any perception of rushed consultation could ignite legal challenges that delay or derail the project, just as past projects experienced. Third, there's the market question: who pays? The MOU points to private sector construction and financing. That means investors will demand a clear business case, long-term Asian demand, stable policy, manageable regulatory risk, and social license that doesn't collapse under protest or litigation. And finally, there's the strategic question Canadians should be asking out loud. If Canada is serious about becoming an energy superpower, what does that mean in 2025 and beyond? Is it primarily about maximizing export volumes, or is it about controlling the full value chain: production, transport, emissions performance, Indigenous equity ownership, and geopolitical leverage, while minimizing environmental risk? Because this debate is no longer just pipeline yes or no, it's about what kind of country Canada wants to be when trade is weaponized, when energy security is back in fashion, and when climate policy is colliding with economic nationalism. So as this proposal moves toward 2026, watch for a few signals. Watch for the route and which communities are on it. Watch for the ownership structure and whether Indigenous participation is real equity with governance, not just symbolism. Watch for how Ottawa handles the tanker moratorium, because that decision will tell you how far the federal government is willing to go. And watch for whether emissions reductions are enforceable and transparent, or whether they remain promises that only matter in press releases. Because if this pipeline happens, it won't just change where Canadian oil goes, it will change Canada's politics, its coastal economy, its climate pathway, and its place in the Indo-Pacific energy chessboard.